we get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Tavio Akimascu. Welcome to our new Implementation Science for Innovation and Discoveries session, first for 2025. We have a few people in the room. We have a few people online, so welcome. I thought I would start out this year's series with a topic that maybe from the distance would look pretty remote or non-intersecting with the topic at hand, which is typically dissemination and implementation science, which is learning health system. But I hope I convince you that this is important for us working in a pretty matrix organization. And second, that there are plenty of overlaps with the traditional concepts of implementation science. And then we can probably do something about this in our own field. I put this provocative title, Are We There Yet? To provoke you for more interactive discussion and questions about the different concepts. I will admit it's a little bit drier topic because it goes a little bit more into theoretical backgrounds and what is a learning health system, but hopefully going forward we'll diversify a little bit and we'll create a little bit more diversity. So I thought I would start my presentation with this famous, you've probably seen it, Charles Darwin's quote, which says it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I liked somebody made a kind of zoologic type of comparison, saying, if you think about the strongest species, maybe it's not the elephants, the most intelligent, maybe it's not the humans, but it's probably the rats, which are the most adaptive. So that's chilling. So learning health systems. So I thought I would start out by showcasing, and this is actually, I downloaded from the National Institute of Health website, data and created this bar graph looking at the NIH research funding from 1938 all the way to 2023. I don't have the data for 2024, but it's probably an increase from the previous year.
Are these adjusted for inflation?
It is not adjusted for inflation. So you may see as a pattern, it's been a continuous growth, maybe with the exception of the sequestration years, they are 2015, 2014. And we'll see what will happen in the near future also with this. But overall, I think that the message is quite clear just from the data. We've had significant continuous increase in the research funding. This is from the same data where I just did a moving average every 5 years, except the last interval, which is only 3 years. And we see we're close to $50 billion on NIH total spending for research. I wanted also to do a reminder about how do we classify research in different domains or categories. It starts from basic, typically lab-based research, to translational, where you start talking about human cells and applicability to humans, to clinical trials in patients in clinics, to health in larger communities, so public health maybe in a lot of those areas, and then global to the entire population. And we often talk about the different portions or swivels or junction points between these from T0, which is really from the point of the request for application, inception, ideas about new projects, how do we find or fund these ideas, and then going traditionally in the linear fashion for T1, which is the point of junction between basic and translational research, and then T2 between translation and clinical and so forth. T5 really represents change into policy, law, how do we influence overall the environment, and typically it's legislative, but goes even beyond that.
So lots of water going in the pipe, not much coming out.
That's right. So it's actually from an actual paper that we submitted to Dr. Shakir and I, and we got published. And we were actually challenging in that paper the traditional pipeline type of stricture model. Challenging it from the point of view that there are too many strictures, and indeed it may not allow all the drops to come out because of that, but also because having this linear type of arrangement will inherently predispose to some dysfunctions and some blockages. And we proposed an alternative type of model, but that's not the purpose of today's talk, so we're not going to go too much into that. You may have seen, especially if you're familiar with the CTSI presentations about the team science approach that Dr. Shakir came up with back in 2015. Which was called trilateral mutually learning ecosystem, and the affecting component came in the last iteration, which is really the team science approach that includes members of the community, members of the health system, and of the academia. So it was called ensemble in contrast with a full orchestra. Maybe you don't need all instruments or every instrument represented in a heavy fashion for every project, but this is kind of the concept, and it's very local team science type of approach in terms of ensembles. So again, going back to the question, are we a learning organization? I thought I would go back a little bit in the history of education as applied to medicine. And if you look at major milestones or landmarks, it's really starting with 1910 Flexner report. That was an approach in trying to restructure education in medical schools, because the concept was if we restructure the curriculum in medical schools, everything else in healthcare will follow, right? But then I thought I would contrast also or juxtapose to that the major milestones in technologies and digital platforms as the evolution from PCs in the 1960s to the World Wide Web in the 90s, and then going to the year 2000s towards the digital world, Internet of Things, and all the electronic health records that kind of structured our work in healthcare. And I thought I could not miss the last major pandemic, coronavirus 19, that really shaped the way we restructured our medical education, our clinical practice, and even our research. So despite being a major tragedy, it did teach us fast some lessons that we can be more adaptable and we can approach this in a different way. A busy slide, and it's actually trying to cram on the same slide and juxtapose also in different time periods the advances in PC, in digital world, in the way infrastructures that we use from a technology point of view, going from PC all the way to Web 4.0. So going from info-centric websites to maybe social media type of 2000 to 2009, and now machine-centric semantic revolution with large language models going all the way to agent-centric intelligent systems. And juxtapose over kind of similar periods of time where we went with research. So we went from research 1.0 with about $5 billion in total NIH expenditures for research, with a focus significantly initially on basic research, and then kind of doubled with each one of those decades, except the last one, but we're not there yet, where you see that we went through a little bit more and shift and focus to clinical research, translational research, and now we're really talking more and more, and it's really due to NCATS, talking more about translational science. How do we operationalize translational research?
I think inflation's eating a lot of that money.
It's point well taken. We can do an analysis. We have it in Excel spreadsheet. It's pretty easy to adjust for inflation.
So translational science kind of almost like how do we take the translational research and actually put it into affecting a problem for
Right. Right. So it's a major shift, and we've approached this a few times in the past. But you're right. You're going from translational research and how do we operationalize what structures and what functions we have in place to make this knowledge translation from one end of the pipeline all the way to the other end in an effective way and not allowing blockages. Right. So it's a mixture of sciences, and I'll come back to that concept. So juxtaposing here with education, where we moved from education 1.0, from a traditional teacher-centered, traditional classroom teaching like we're doing now, maybe, based on memorization and standard exams and assessments. And then we kind of moved to more towards student-centered, learner-driven, and then we started to kind of look into flipped classrooms, the advance of the MOOCs. And then now we're like looking at emerging technologies kind of being leveraged in education with AI and VR and AR and realities, and so forth. And now we're really focusing more on performance-based assessments and competencies-based evaluations.
Yeah, but is education really better today than it was in the 80s?
That's a different topic. We probably need an hour and a half to say yes or no, or maybe. That's a good point, though. But I think the same question can be asked when we move from 1.0 to 2.0 in education and in health systems, in research. Was the progress commensurate? Was it commensurate with the investment? Probably not, right? And then for the health system, kind of an oversimplification, but we went from paper medical records, then kind of evolving over time to electronic health records, from X-rays, ultrasound to CTs, MRIs, and now 3D imaging modalities. And of course, electronic health records, Internet of Things, and all the advanced technologies that allow us to be faster, more nimble, and maybe computational to have better power. So you would think this is an interesting kind of juxtaposition, but I thought it's important for us to kind of set the ground for where we're going with the creation of a learning health system. So you may have seen this slide before. I think it's one of the most important slides in implementation science that is really kind of classifying the types of investigative approaches into a few categories. And really the question in the center of an implementation science approach is you're interested in a specific practice or practice of interest or intervention. And you ask yourself, do we need to study this? And of course, when you ask that question, you want to see, are there any efficacy studies show that this intervention, this strategy is actually effective? And if they are already research in that kind of answer and equivocally that question, then you don't need to do efficacy research anymore. You go to an effectiveness type of question, meaning that maybe you have shown a molecule that is effective in a phase 1, phase 2 type of trials. How do we go in humans in a larger scale and more controlled environment and try to answer the question, do we have effectiveness proof? And if we do, then you don't need to do that arm anymore. If you don't, then you really do. But if you do, then you start asking yourself, knowing that type of knowledge, how do we apply it? And it's really application that is part of the implementation science type of studies, where you start looking at what are the mixed methods to evaluate the context, how do you design a specific strategy, and then how do you test the specific strategy. And sometimes you may have gray areas where you really don't know if your intervention or strategy works, or it works only in specific settings or in specific subgroups, but not in every environment. And then you may need to do a hybrid type of study. There are 3 types of hybrid effectiveness implementation science. We're not going to go into detail, but I think this kind of seeing the big map of the subway here in between efficacy research lines, effectiveness research lines, and implementation type of research is important. Amy Kilborn from University of Michigan pointed this out. We may have good translation from efficacy studies to effectiveness studies, but then we see a huge gap, a huge drop-off into implementation and dissemination studies. And that gap may lead to complete blockage of translation, or it may lead to significant delays. So she's quoting also David Chambers and Gila Mehta from a landmark paper, and said, really, if you care about a new practice, effective therapy, new intervention, new strategy, and you want to see how that translates, it really depends on the number of factors. And they are kind of linear factors dependent on each other. One, is it adopted? Second, are the practitioners trained to use it? Are the trained practitioners really willing to use it? And then the fourth one is, do we have patient populations and general populations that benefit from it? And the assumption in the paper is, and this is a very generous assumption, that 50% of the time we're successful with each one of those. Being a linear process, you end up with a 6% benefit. So in the most optimistic case with a new intervention, taking it through that type of framework, you end up with very low adoption. So getting closer to the learning systems, one of the first papers that came out in the literature and speaking about learning organizations is this landmark paper in Harvard Business Review by David Garvin that says continuous improvement is important for every organization. But unfortunately, failed programs far outnumber successes, and improvement rates remain distressingly low. Why? Because most companies have failed to grasp a basic truth. Continuous improvement requires a commitment to learn. So this is 1993. I really liked it. On the first page, he also gives us an answer. It says, scholars are partly to blame. Their discussions of learning organizations have been reverential and utopian, filled with near mystical terminology. So it's actually something that I've seen from colleagues in other industries, that they say, well, every time when you guys get into these concepts, you try to reinvent the wheel. You try to create a specific knowledge base, a specific literature that applies to you, as if you are accepted from the other findings that were published before. And then over time, you develop this mythology and this theoretical frameworks that kind of push people away instead of taking them, getting into the operations of it. So 1993, Garvin study says, a learning organization, it's an organization that is able to create, acquire, and transfer knowledge, and to modify its behavior to reflect the new knowledge and the insights from it. That was a definition for a learning organization. Now, how does that apply to a health system or healthcare system? IOM, Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, came out in 2007 with an applied definition for health systems. It's a system in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation, with best practices seamlessly embedded in the delivery process, with patients and families, active participants in all elements, and new knowledge captured as an integral byproduct of the delivery experience. Sorry for the very theoretical, kind of lengthy definition. I like this visualization because it kind of takes you from inception, innovation, idea, T0 type of approach with inspiration to investigation. So you study that, you explore in a kind of controlled format, and then you take it to implement it. And in healthcare would be in clinics, right? What I think this framework is missing is the feedback loop, which is really about how do you improve it. So if you went from the innovation all the way to the implementation, you come back to try to close that loop. So the concept of learning organization kind of evolved over time, and the author started to kind of look at what are the major domains, what are the major components that one has to pay attention. One is the learning environment. So almost like a cult for you need to learn, you need to continuously to improve, you need to have a specific interest in embracing innovation, embracing new knowledge. But then leadership is another important component where the leaders have to be learners themselves, and to facilitate, to create an environment that is prone for facilitation of the new knowledge created.
So you're missing funding.
Well,
Money will do it.
yeah.
No, not necessarily.
We'll come back to that. I think you're pinpointing an important component there. Yeah. And then, of course, there are the processes and practices that you have in place, and then how do you operationalize your day-to-day things, and external influences. And some of the external influences could be funding, but sometimes you need internal funding. And again, those are kind of laid out specifically later on. I thought I would put on one single slide what are the major key traits of all learning organizations. So not healthcare specific, but learning organizations in general. So collaborative learning culture, knowledge sharing with team-based learning and systems thinking approaches, a lifelong learning mindset. So you may have heard about flexible organization or agile environments or agile organizations. So kind of one of the key dynamic components. Innovation, so mental models for how do you embrace new knowledge and new approaches, and forward-thinking leadership with good vision and kind of change leadership. And we'll come back to change leadership. So I think I already mentioned what's the definition of the learning health care system. Now we're evolving more towards health system instead of healthcare system. Knowledge generation is embedded in the daily clinical practice to continuously improve quality, safety, and outcomes. So maybe this is an subconscious approach for me to answer the question in the title, but it's a lot of times it's an aspirational goal. I was actually at a conference in December, and the speaker asked the entire audience to raise their hands if they thought they were in a learning health system. And there was no hand up. And he said, this is the appropriate answer. Nobody has a perfect learning health system. So it's aspirational for a lot of organizations, although I may say we're not all in the same point of the journey. Now, interestingly enough, when you read the literature about learning health systems, some folks say, well, it's really about your electronic health records. This is what structures your work. This is what creates the dynamic approach. This is what creates flexibility. That's the key point for a learning health system. And while I see the point, I'm not sure I embrace it completely, that it's all about electronic health records. It's way more than about other things. So again, I wanted to give you the definition again, maybe a little bit more space out there. So it's a system in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation for the three components: the practices, patients and families, and new knowledge creation. I already asked that question. I already gave you my bias that it's probably not an electronic health record only, but it's beyond that. So now let's get into the thick of it, which is learning health cycle. So Charles Friedman at University of Michigan came up with this concept a few years back, and he says every organization that is a learning organization and is focusing on health systems now, they have this cycle where knowledge gets transmitted and then transferred across the cycle that really has three major domains, three components. One is the practice, the lower part, the green part there. The second one is the data science part, where you start assembling the data from the practice, analyze the data, interpret it. And then the implementation side, which is the designing of interventions based on the data acquired and interpreted, implement it, take action, and then disseminate. And then it goes back into the practice. How do you incorporate those specific strategies, those specific measures to make it work better? And then he modified the cycles by saying, well, we need to incorporate the community. And he created that appendix there at 5 o'clock where he says, well, we need to have this formation of a learning community, and the community at large has to be part of it. I superimpose there our concept of team science ensemble with academia, health system, and community part of it. But he says, really, you should start the cycle from that point, from that appendix. Once you have the community, learning community created, then you can go on the cycle. And then he added also that there is a lot of times needed to have eyes open for external evidence, because just going and implementing what you've learned in your own practice may not be enough. You may need to be continuously active in business intelligence, see what others discover. The other addition to that model from Charles Friedman was that each one of these segments of the cycle has to have their own feedback mechanisms. So I incorporated plan, do, check, act, but it can be any type of QI or any type of feedback loop that you create for improvement of that specific segment. So when I showed this to Dr. Shakir last year, he said, something is wrong about it. I don't know what, I cannot pinpoint, but something can be done better. And what you'll see in the next few slides is maybe an approach to try to get that cycle improved. One of the first changes, community is not part of that appendix anymore. It's in the center. Why? Because you have to have the data to knowledge, the knowledge to practice, and the practice to data phases all interacting with the community. You have to design it, co-design it together, and you have to operate together in creating those specific functions and structures. The second one is that external evidence doesn't come only in the data science field, it's everywhere. We see new frameworks of implementation all the time. We see new frameworks or new practices, how do we incorporate telemedicine, right? COVID gave us a good push into that direction, but there are other areas where the external evidence has to be considered. So I considered all those three junctions between the D to K, K to P, P to D, important areas for incorporating external evidence. And again, PDCA or any type of feedback loop to improve that specific area is important. So this is the typical, the general framework. I would show you in the next few slides. how do you integrate these three components in a learning health system? But then the question becomes, what does practice mean? If you look at the bottom of that graph, what is practice? Well, it could be clinical practice, right? And a lot of times when people do look at the cycle, they think about clinical operations, patients coming to the clinic, hospital operations, and how do you practice, and then how do you collect data, analyze, interpret, design new interventions, and kind of improve along the way. But this would be great if we're talking about a community health system, a community health hospital that doesn't really have any education component or research component. It will apply very well, and you would pay attention to all the systems, right? If you think about it, the way non-single private practice type of practices that occurred in the 70s and 80s were single specialty or multi-specialty groups that were paying attention exactly to how to improve their practice. If they were a group of cardiac surgeons, was it Mayo Clinic, was it Cleveland Clinic, was it Emory Clinic, or any other place, they were very much focused on clinical practice and how to make it better. So they started to look at how people they were operating on, how are they doing, or what type of operation was more successful. That's the basis, and it would be still today, if you apply it to a community health system, it would be still very valid. About research. Well, we have different research operations, right? So my contention is that we have to apply the same type of cycle for research, where we're talking about research operations and then capture the data. How do you operationalize your research operations? And then again, you apply the data science tools to analyze and come up with some specific implementation strategies to improving and then coming back into the same cycle. And if you are a community hospital that is a teaching hospital or a health system that has trainees, then you would pay attention to educational activities and how do you change that practice, how you capture the data, what are the significant outcomes, and then going back into the cycle. So my contention is that in academic health system, you need to have an integrated learning health cycle that you're overlaying the education, research, and clinical practice, and pay attention to the specific mechanisms. How do you improve the motion, the movement on the circle? And the revolution can be faster in some of these versus others, but at the same time, how big the circle is, right? So if you look at a specific institution, how much is clinical practice, how much is research, how much is education, and how fast is that innovation being translated? It could be very different in different domains. But the point is, you have to design specific systems for each one of the major missions. And then if you overlay them, you have to start looking at what's the impact and what are the outcomes, with a little bit of differentiation between what they are, and then again having community in the center. So community kind of crosses across along all those domains and be part of how do you define the outcomes, the relevant outcomes, and what's the impact. And then to make it more complicated, I thought I would add at the roots of that a kind of a strategic approach. How do you create the environment for a learning health organization? Well, you have to pay attention to your assets, and that relates to footprint, North Wisconsin, East Wisconsin, South Wisconsin. What clinic networks do you have? What specific specialties do you develop in certain areas? What hospitals, what buildings, what computers or supercomputers and other type of infrastructure you develop? But then resources are your people, your faculty, your clinicians, your researchers, your educators. And then how do you combine those to create specific capabilities and competencies that will differentiate you from others? Classic kind of strategic framework that I think it's very useful. And if you don't remember what is what, think about mining operations. Assets would be the drilling equipment, the resource would be the gas or oil or whatever you're drilling for, but then how effective you are, how efficient you are, how fast you are, how nimble you adjust to demand would be your capabilities and competence. Yes?
And each of those layers then is the same thing, this top level model, is that also going on at these other?
Yeah, so that's my contention, that you have to apply for all those three and then see what's the foundation, because you're not going to be hiring, let's say, 100 educators who are just doing education, 100 researchers who are just going to do research, and 100 clinicians to do just clinical practice. But you will be combining them, right? And if you do combine them, then you start looking into a more integrated fashion. How do we redesign the system, or what components of the system need to be reinforced, with specific assets, with specific resources or capabilities.
So everything on these bottom layers are kind of in service of that approach.
Clinical practice, research, and education, with the thought that we have to look at what are the outcomes, what is the impact, and how do we readjust based on that top layer, right?
Okay, so that's really dispelling the silos in a way. I mean, because go deep in
Right.
capabilities, resources, assets, not functions.
That's right. That's a great point. Every time when you dissect a body, the organs that you're dissecting lose their functionality. My contention is that you should actually try to do some like 3D virtual dissection where you can look at parts without losing their function, right? So they are superimposed there, those three domains: clinical practice, education, research, but they have to work together. So if we're thinking from the point of view of our own institutions, we have the health system at the bottom there, right? Afraid of TerraCare. We have the Data Science Institute there on the left side. I thought, we have specific capabilities in the field of data science. And we have the CTSI at the top. And I thought, investigators come to CTSI, and then you have the innovation incubator, I call the T0, but there are a number of ways you can incorporate, a number of groups and functions you can incorporate there. And you go linearly or non-linearly to T5, let's say, all the way. But then you have the team science ensembles working in these. You have an educational component. You have the Clinical Translation Research Center that is operationalizing some of the clinical trials. And then you have the QI and the dissemination and implementation groups all coming together. I would say there is an arrow there. The arrow that goes from education should go into the practice in the lower part. So if you're not convinced that it's complex enough, I put some arrows there, or how this flow of information can be from one side to another. But this is a great way of actually visualizing the CTSI data science as a health system, and how do we work together in a learning health system plan. That's lost some of its color, but it's complex purposefully. And what this is actually showing you TR is translational research circle, and TS is translational science. And that's the main kind of circle of the figure, but it's showing you how much overlap there is with other disciplines, and how translational science is really a multidisciplinary mix of QI, quality improvement, implementation science, public health, marketing science, communication science, design thinking, functional design, data science, change leadership and change management, human factors engineering, improvement science. It's about 20 disciplines that actually Chris Austin articulated this about 10 years ago from NCATS, and there are more disciplines that keep being added. Why? Because none of these actually have the specific capabilities and specific frameworks to address it in a comprehensive fashion. That's why I think translational science has to be this kind of transdisciplinary approach. So I mentioned there a few of them, and I thought I would give you from the paper I published with Dr. Shakir about a few components. One is change management versus change leadership. So what is change management? It's a systematic approach of dealing with the transformation, with change. And it's really about having a very detailed plan, like planning, execution, reinforcing changes. It's all like, if you want, an Excel spreadsheet, a project manager type of approach, where you say, this is the change we want to approach, to accomplish, and this is how we're going to approach it and deal with it. While change leadership is, you really need to have the vision. You really need to know where you're moving. It's not an Excel spreadsheet that is already populated. You need to come up with what are the specific ideas, and how do we embrace what type of innovation. And so you need leadership that will guide people and motivate people to go in the direction. So it's not that much of a tactical approach as you would see with the change management. It's more strategic approach. So again, lots of words, because I just took this directly from our review paper, but hopefully you get the idea that you actually, in a learning health system, you need a good combination of change management and change leadership. Both of them would be very important. How about systems engineering? So we were in healthcare. Why do we care about engineering? Well, because engineering is really not building bridges. It's about more than that. And systems engineering is a field that is actually focusing on designing and managing complex systems. And it looks over the entire life cycle of the product and then try to approach that in a holistic fashion, almost like the discussion we had earlier about, don't dissect the organs, just keep them all in a holistic fashion in the same system and see what needs to happen to make it functional and then make it function over a longer period of time, and what systems type of thinking you have to employ for that. I will skip this lengthy paragraph, but that's the idea. And another one that I found while I was searching for literature and looking at what's intersecting with translational science is improvement science. It seems that this is an evolving science that is combining frameworks and knowledge from both implementation science and QI. It's the study of or discipline focused on understanding and implementing methods needed to enhance quality, efficiency, and effectiveness, particularly in healthcare education and other service-related environments. I would skip this. I think the focus is, or the important component of this is the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary fashion. So going back to the basics there, showing you again the pipeline of clinical or the research, translational continue, and overlaying that of the data science continue. So you start looking a little bit of overlap there between computational and informational sciences, which is like computational theories and models that may be able aligning better with basic research and early translational research. Then you kind of define the health problems, and then you start looking at data ontologies, what are the methods and models, and that kind of defines more biomedical informatics. And then you move all the way to the right, more the way to the applicability of those specific interventions, information technology with different applications. How do you deploy them? How do you support them? Again, going back to the electronic health records, Internet of Things, and so forth. So there is one point that is important here. A cycle has 3 junctions there, a learning health cycle. And every time when you have moving parts in a mechanical system, that's prone to breakage, right? And I call this dysfunction locus number 1, which is you may be great at acquiring information, analyzing, and coming back with great models, but if you don't start deploying that into implementation strategies and measures, you're not doing much, you're going to have a blockage there. And our solution to that was to create an implementation action transformation center in the CTSI, and to deploy the specific educational offerings that can help us to bridge that gap between the data science or data to knowledge to practice. This series is one of them, but we thought the implementation science course that we're offering in our Masters of Clinical and Translational Science is another one. And then we thought we would start a blue sky type of meetings where we would have folks from the different rounds of the campus come together and discuss about their own areas of interest or practice and see how they can collaborate and come up with projects. Again, taking it from acquisition and accumulation of knowledge all the way to the implementation. The second locus of dysfunction is when you may come up with great QI or IS teams, but you're not deploying them in clinical practice, or you may do QI project at a very small scale, but you never scale it up. You never learn or benefit from what you acquired during those projects. And again, we thought an impact center can help with that, blue sky group meetings. And then how do we bring in the folks from the healthcare system? It's another major, I think, problem that we have to deal with. To me, is the fact that there is significant intersection between QI and implementation science, QI and systems engineering, human factors engineering, and implementation science. It does provide us the opportunity to bring in folks who work in QI, for example, in the healthcare system, or nurses, for example, and be part of the team science groups.
So the QI people are walking on everybody else?
Well, QI, so the Lean Six Sigma approach sometimes lacks the scaling up part.
I get sorry about that, but I won't waste your time.
Okay, we can discuss it later, yeah. While the third locus of dysfunction is this issue where you may be able to practice perfectly, but then if you don't start analyzing the data from your practice, clinical practice, then you're not going to be able to continuously to improve. And again, those are some early approaches on how we can help with that. I thought I would list Dr. Goday's CTSI Academy offerings that may be helpful with some of those concepts.
CTSI is awesome.
CTSI, well, it's a CTSI Academy. So learning health system, it's one of the segments in this circle. And I find this framework called DART from implementation science very useful. So it does show you on the same diagram, learning health system, stakeholders, partnerships, and design innovations for dissemination and implementation with the important components, innovation, clinics and people, and community users. But it really goes back to what determines the pace of translation, how fast that knowledge moves on the learning health cycle. It's a function of how effective is the intervention you're looking at. That's the E there in the numerator. And D, what's the demand? Is there any urgency from the practitioners, from the researchers, from the educators to implement it? Those are in the numerators. But then it's inversely proportional to the cost and the risks. So the risks are actually in this paper, and I'm glad they thought it over. It's a risk ratio. It's the risk of applying the innovation divided by the risk of status quo. Kind of goes back into the demand. If the risk of status quo is perceived as high urgency for change, that may help you. But it's also, you come up with a new process, if that endangers the way things are done or how the structure of the current work is, that could be a significant component. And the same thing kind of, it's in the cost. It could be financial cost, it would be time cost, it would be resource, faculty, trainees cost, but it's also the disruptive effects of the innovation that may change that risk ratio. So I find this framework is very useful when we look at new interventions that are more from the technology side or in the digital world.
Oh, is F a known function?
It's what?
Is F a known function?
It's just a function. Yeah, it's a function of that. So it's directly proportional to those two and inversely proportional to the other two. Does that answer your question?
I don't know. I'm struggling with the units. Is P
Well-
inverse? I mean, this is a very complex.
Right. Well, but yeah, it's a conceptual thing. Don't think about that. You're going to start looking at units of pace, of units of demand, right? But it's like when you're evaluating conceptually, what's the demand? How impactful is the intervention? What's the risk? What is the cost?
So it's more like a relationship between these variables.
Function relationship, yeah. It's not a specific y equals a0 plus a1x and so forth.
All of them are being worked on with a degree of uncertainty around.
Of course, an epsilon there, absolutely. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but this is going back to the concept that electronic health records equals learning health system. We've all seen, major sentinel events where you may have major disasters happening because of human factors and digital factors don't interact in the most effective way. This is a case of a major liability, major lawsuit where things did not get moved in translation and communication with the electronic health system and the healthcare practitioner. While I was talking about the T0 to T5, this is kind of the paradigm that we're working today, but this paradigm actually goes back way more. In time, it's about 70 years. So this is a great book. I actually bought it and almost finished it. It talks about the Pasteur's quadrant. So this was, in fact, a paper, a white paper that was asked by one of the US presidents. I think it was Roosevelt, who asked for how do we fix the issue of research in this country? And the author of the paper, Bush, no connection with the current presidents or previous or after the presidents. He looked at research started in two different directions, two different quadrants. There, one from the point of view of the understanding, so the fundamental understanding. It's kind of aligning more with the basic research, and that's the Niels Bohr quadrant, where it's all theoretical, it's all in vitro, it's all non-applied. On the other hand, you're looking at Thomas Edison, it's like the desire to develop light bulb, and I don't care how it works. I just want to make sure that it's safe and it doesn't burst and it gives us enough lumens and so forth. And finds the example of Louis Pasteur, who was a great example of how do you combine the fundamental basic research with the applied research. Because Pasteur not only had his knowledge in chemistry, but he was doing consulting for different companies and apply those for companies to take their innovation to marketplace. Good book to consider if you have some time. A few tools that are available to us, free, open access. TimeCat is the time and motion studies that have been used since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it's a tool widely available, widely used in other industries, and trying to look at how much time does it take for each specific segment in the work process, and what are the factors that are related to humans, and how can we intervene and optimize those. And they started to be used for different type of analysis, for like data scrubbing, de-identification, federated analysis, data synthesis, MD clone, offering some synthetic data. So you can actually start looking at using these tools and applying them to optimize those different steps. I'm going to skip this one and show you this slide, which is really how do we design the perfect system? Yes.
On your last slide, so is that about this notion of capturing practice as data?
That's right. That's right. So the previous slide, this one, right? Yes. So how do you analyze? And it actually is not only for that segment where it's data to practice or practice to knowledge or knowledge to practice, but you can actually, each one of the phases, since we said we're going to design our PDCA cycles for each one of them, you can start looking at how long does it take from when we get the analysis from the electronic health system, or we get the data from the electronic health system to analyze it, and then kind of come up with some relevant output, and then how do we incorporate that, or what teams will take it from there to design specific interventions, for example. So you can have this type of time and motion studies to analyze that specific segment and say, can we optimize this? Can we change the way human factors are coming into play? So again, the concept of designing the perfect system, you can very well say you're a learning health system if you already apply some measures, and then you say, you see, it works perfectly.
You can put it on the website.
That's right. That's right. That's right. It's a good marketing tool, right? So going back to the what's translational science. So I found this paper was very good. It was focused a little bit on connection between education and health systems, but really outlined the important elements, the key elements, what alignments you need to create a learning health system. And one is to have the right people with the right skills and experience. And for example, researchers, right? To use researchers only for statistical analysis of basic research, or you use them for analyzing the operations data. And the answer is the latter if you can, and blurry the lines a little bit and get them involved so at least they can talk to the subspecialized groups who do that only. So having the right skills, right experience, the right people, it's an important element. So it's always taking some build up there to have those type of resources. So subculture is called, I would say culture. I don't like the word subculture, there's some derogatory meaning there, but it's really about how do you embed all those strategic elements in creating a culture that is prone to embrace innovation, be able to accept the risk of kind of failing fast and move forward, and instead of dwelling on a bad idea for a long time and not de-implement when needed. And then the external funding, yeah, so that would be very hard without significant external funding. And ARC has had some rounds of funding, and PCORI also, about finding the right institutions that can grow in this direction, becoming a learning health system. Some internal systems of funding would be important too. So we may have even institutionally seeds of money that can be used in building and creating those building blocks for a learning health system. And of course, the executive leadership, we talked about that a few times. You need to see good strategies there coming from the top. There is the leaders are learners and continue to learn and improve and encourage that type of developing system. So this is a slide from this paper that talks about the metaverse that applies to education, but not only. where if you are talking about a health science university or an academic medical center, you should start with a foundational work, try to see what are the needs assessment, how ready are you for certain steps, what collaborations would you need, what stakeholders you need to engage. That's really step number 1 or 0 if you want. And then you start looking at what type of curriculum I'm going to design, how I'm going to develop the process, and what, again, resources, assets, capabilities I'm going to build over time, and then kind of implement it and evaluate and continuously improve. So going basically to the same kind of concepts of the learning health system cycle. And this is my last slide. And I think it's pretty telling. There are some things medical science cannot explain, like where our healthcare system is heading to. So thanks for your attention, and open for Q&A.
How many people are online? Do we know?
How many people are online?
There's 6.
And you're monitoring the chat.
I have it.
Yes.
So this is probably a totally unfair question. First of all, I think this is great, all the stuff that you told us today. Maybe a little bit mystical, okay, but great stuff.
Not utopian?
Huh?
Not utopian?
Maybe a little utopian. I come from the pessimistic end of the scale, so yes. But that's not what worries me. What worries me is there's only 9 people here and 6 people online. This place should be loaded. You shouldn't even be able to fit in here. I just don't get it. I mean, everybody needs to hear what you have to say. Here.
That is indeed bad news. I can counter a little bit with the optimistic side to say we post this on the CTSI website and we see hundreds of visualizations after the fact. So that's the little bit more encouraging thing. But yeah, there's no replacement to this, to real interaction and kind of coming together with new ideas and then ways to go forward about it. And yeah, I would like to see leaders also getting involved.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Alex.
This is a big idea, but playing very much what you just said as well. I'll try and get through as quickly as possible. I'm forgetting the title of the book that IS4ID looked at.
First quadrant.
No, not in this talk.
Oh.
The book that we looked at.
Oh, the goal?
The goal.
Okay.
Yes. So, so there was a book. I guess it's in the vein of implementation. Yeah, implementation and improvement. It was coming very much from the perspective of like classic manufacturing industry, but pointing out that I think one of the key things that was somewhat generalizable was if you optimize for maximal usage of individual parts of the system, you've inherently created a bottleneck because it's at maximum usage. You can't do anything else. It's very hard to change or make improvements at that point. And I admit, I kind of wrestle with that as someone who's leading a software team. I don't have machines, and I hope I don't treat my team like they're machines. But I actually came across a totally separate thing where someone was reflecting on the very same book and ideas, but in a software development paradigm, and pointing out, no, if you want to be able to be flexible and change direction, or if your goal is actually better software products, then you actually need to have essentially capacity in your workforce and in your workers such that they actually have, percentages of time which could be redirected when you identify a problem, when we identify a new opportunity. And it occurs to me that the same thing actually applies in a learning health system. And it, again, I say in the industrial setting and even in the commercial software development setting, in some ways, it's easier it is at least rewarding if you get it right, because you actually have market forces that come to bear and help, and the company that does this well makes more profit, can go on and do more things. I'm being slightly polemic about it. I wonder how you get that actual incentive into the health systems when you've optimized for the maximum moment in time productivity of your actual medical staff. They're not here they're not here in this talk, but they also have the capacity to actually pursue a new implementation or do the work that's necessary to investigate it. again, to be slightly utopian about it, you kind of get that in part when you start rewarding health systems for the health of their communities, rather than for the amount of revenue they bring in for the sick people that they see.
But they tried that, that didn't work
Well, did they? Well, you tried.
But it's about strategy, really, right? So because in a simplistic way, you define strategy as a trade-off of alternatives, right? So if you say I need 2 additional developers for this software to produce this software, that's one specific alternative that has to be considered by leadership, while there may be a few others like, oh, we need 3 medical assistants in X clinic tomorrow. Which one is going to happen first? And you're right. Do we track those outcomes with the impact all the way to the community to say, well, now feedback mechanisms should tell us we should actually go back and help Alex with his group because that software is going to help us do the scheduling.
I'm proposing, creating more flexibility even in the provider space, because otherwise because we actually.
Oh, so you mean why is not Epic more flexible?
No, that's a whole other question. I mean, I've spent 10 years of my career now, last 10 years, working with ingesting EHR. My main role is building the clinical research data warehouse. So, and I do see that there's some benefit, there's significant benefit there, and there's a wealth of data there. But I think there is also a huge and under-recognized observability problem. You can't see what's not already in the system. And I think there's actually a huge opportunity in scope of looking to be a learning health system and I've only seen it done once, and it was very on a small scale, and it's not being maintained. But another institution was starting to develop a patient health record or a personalized health record. Mm-hmm. So it was something that the patients themselves could add information to in a pretty flexible way, and then have it with them and bring it and present it to their doctor. So they actually had ways of tracking, like, these are what the side effects have been for me, rather than just trying to recall it. I mean, another example, one of the projects we work on is with sickle cell disease. There's questions being asked around, well, how that's a disease that can be hugely disruptive to an individual when they're in crisis. It can affect their ability to work, it can affect their ability to get here for appointments and that kind of thing. If they never show up, they never get up. Again, the percentage of patients who are asked the social determinant of health question about transport is tiny compared to the population, even within the population when where the clinic knows that it matters. And you never get any information on the people who don't show up. But if you can identify patient populations which we know are poorly observed or around things we don't know what to observe, actually providing them with some tools to record information like, I couldn't get to the appointment today. Even something that simple. But the other key thing about that implementation, which was interesting, was yes, they provided some common data elements as best they could, but they didn't close the system. They actually allowed patients to insert their own things that they wanted to record. Now, maybe that ends up being, that does end up being very hard to reconcile and generate and systematize afterwards. But at least it helps identify things, and it helps. And I think that's a thing that's maybe missing in the ensemble model, because you talked about outside information. It's actually giving the tools to the community to get that information into the system in the first place.
To the patients.
Yeah, I think it's actually a huge opportunity, and I think it's something which the technology has gotten to the point where it's good enough you could actually try and do.
Do with patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials, you hand a patient a tablet or a cell phone, and they do their daily or weekly assessments where they report how they're feeling, their mood, etc. There's validated questionnaires programmed into a device, and you track patients over the course of clinical trials. So that technology's been around for a while.
20 years.
Yeah.
And it's still not in clinical care. So There you go.
So there's the opportunity.
never gonna happen.
perhaps, is that kind of what you're talking about? Is like
Yeah.
patients could
Yes,
report on their own data?
It's also about data missingness and how you deal with that, right? What model are you going to create and put in place to be comfortable that the missingness is not influencing your major decisions, right?
well, it's happening now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's there now in the EHR. We don't think of it.
We had a cohort study that we created at the VA about 15 years ago that we followed for more than 10 years on average. So each patient from my clinics was part of that, and there were a few other clinics, and we followed them for 10 years. And then you go back, this is VA health system that was an electronic health record since the 1980s. You can capture pretty much everything that was in the health system. The amount of missingness was unbelievable. Just dealing with that and say, we're going to ignore what's missing, it's a major source of error. And how do you fix that? No, I mean, you're going to become more granular, you're going to collect more, and you're going to need higher computational capabilities.
National.
Quality.
Well, doesn't that create a possibility of oligopoly or monopoly, and then no mechanisms for improvement?
Yeah, I mean, think big or go home.
My concern is that we're going to get more and more granular over time naturally. And all our efforts and resources we put into tagging and standardizing will be out of the window. We'll start using other standards. And all that effort is going to be kind of superfluous.
There's a lot, the Romans already are way ahead of us. They wrote about that over 2,000 years ago.
Question, in terms of evaluating a learning health system, it's so complex. There's never going to be an institution or an entity that is fully accomplished in achieving a functional delivering LHS. It's a sliding scale. It always is going to be. How do you propose this should be measured, or what are currently metrics being used to measure where you are? If you compare 10 institutions, where do you lie in that spectrum? What are the frameworks for that evaluation?
Yeah, so I think being in the early days of institutions becoming learning health systems will invariably lead us towards benchmarking being kind of the mechanism where people will say, oh, Mayo is doing it, this is how they're doing, Michigan is doing, this is how they're doing, let's try to emulate that. And there will be innovations and there will be improvements and tweaks to that. So I think that's going to be the first phase. We're going to be a small mass, and it's encouraged a lot of times by funding mechanisms, right? So if PCORI puts a lot of money into it, if AHRQ puts a lot of money into it, yeah, that will spur that type of nucleation. But then moving from benchmarking into creating a framework similar to what you do for quality accreditation, right? Or what you do with Malcolm Baldbridge type of QI awards, where somebody comes and says, okay, let's take a look at this framework, check, oh, you're missing here,
Right.
check. What is in the end going to be that mosaic of accomplishments and lack of accomplishments going to be adjudicated as, I don't know, and who's going to know where we're going to go with that? But it's going to be multidimensional, it's going to be complex, it's going to be with so many dependencies, almost impossible to track.
Right, I mean, it's so complex.
Right.
I mean, one of the things, like when you were talking about the academy courses, we've had some 3,000 some graduates. Majority of them are staff, some are faculty, some of them are partners, so on and so forth. Yeah, we collect evaluations after every course, and we get great evaluations of the presenter, of the topic, of the course overall. What I would like to know really is like, okay, a person who has taken a CTS Academy course or courses and now is doing their job, how much better are they at their job? I don't want to test them on how much better you are at learning what we taught. Actually, how much better is if Amit attended 3 courses, can Amit actually do a better IRB submission today as compared to someone else? that those be some, I mean, that's kind of part of LHS.
It's education 5.0.
That's right. That's right. So, you're your own control. And if you change your context, your environment, it doesn't apply anymore. But who's going to judge that? Is it you, or is it the person, the IRB coordinator, or who's going to judge your performance comparative?
I can be pretty judgy.
It's part of the tension I feel when we talk about translation science.
Right.
I mean, it's a very soft science, in part because of the complexity, and we're trying to apply it in a healthcare or learning health system space, where many of the thought leaders are trained in a much harder form of science, where at least at the basic level, right. Even basic biology is around really trying to do these things with control. I mean, the double-blind clinical trial is the gold standard for the effectiveness of a new treatment. We don't have a control for almost any of this. It doesn't make sense to
Randomize the students.
Well, but maybe it's going back to the outcomes and impact. If you're able to quantify those and then stratify healthcare organizations based on the impact and outcomes, and then you go back and see what frameworks, what system did they use? Maybe they didn't use a learning health system, maybe they have a different type of system, and see what elements work there and what don't. My concern is that you see that in implementation science, you see that in quality improvement. Context is king. You may take the perfect system from the place where it originated and try to implant somewhere else, and it's not going to work. And then each one of us is going to have a different version of a learning health system or some other framework. But at least you can say, we go back by the outcomes. If the outcomes was a seamless submission to the IRB, hey, it worked.
Right.
But it goes back to the same point about what is education. Is that a value added for the learner, or it's a value added for the institution, for the community, for the system, for the population, right?
Yeah, I mean, at some point, implement LHS and maturity model might look like, oh, how quicker are you able to treat flu with how few medicines, how much preventative aspect is involved now as opposed to just curative aspect. If you have meaningful access to a whole bunch of data, you should be able to affect change on these kind of things.